I forgot to tell you about this. Someone in chat reminded me. Thanks. Classic Plus. Classic Plus might actually happen. So I think we're going to have to talk about that. Because as somebody who's playing Modern and does not have the time for Classic, the idea of Classic Plus is the one thing that could actually get me in there in a decently big way. Classic Plus is a pretty wild idea, and it's one that I think essentially comes from old school RuneScape. In old school RuneScape, now I played RuneScape 2007, a good amount of time, and the way that worked is they changed RuneScape over time to the point where the RuneScape players were like, guys, we seriously like the old version more. So Jagex actually listened to their community, they did old school RuneScape, and then I believe a big community poll was held, which basically said, do we keep old school RuneScape as old school RuneScape as it was and don't change it? Or do we continue development of old school RuneScape with a development philosophy that is very much rooted in what made old school RuneScape what it was? So what has essentially happened is Blizzard have sent out surveys to players, and you can probably, I mean, if you do a Google
no problem.
So Blizzard basically, they did these surveys, and through those surveys, we basically learned the Classic Plus is something that Blizzard is actually considering doing. Now, you may think this is, just a survey, whatever. No, I mean, Classic TBC. That is something that we initially found out about via surveys that Blizzard put into people's email addresses. The way that Blizzard are handling advancing from Classic into Classic TBC, that is also something that's, that we found out via survey. And here is the big survey that people are talking about. And I think one of those pages anyway is covering the idea of Classic Plus, where basically, so these servers could have changes that dramatically change aspects of the game experience and would make it different from what the original World of Warcraft experience was like. Now, they give examples of layering for high pop servers, changes to the PvP honor system, stuff like that. Now, it's hard to say how far they would go. And there's certainly an argument to be said that, stats and ratings only scale so much before the end game breaks. So if they were to do a Classic Plus that involved new raid tiers, I don't know how they could stretch that out into the future for long enough. However, I think there is a humongous opportunity here for Blizzard to capitalize on what I think is the more unique essence of Classic, and that is that Classic is so Wild West in so many ways, and I think a bit more player-driven, that a Classic Plus system that works could add an element of sandbox into the game. Like changes to the PvP honor system. Now, you could just do that in a way where some of the, welfare grinding of it goes away and it feels more player friendly or whatever. They could just do something small like that. Or they could work in world PvP to the point where like world PvP on a server is something that feels more sandboxy. And who knows what that is? I mean, old school RuneScape has got Wildy, there's nullsec areas in EVE Online. I don't know what they would do. But there's a chance I think they could make Classic actually more sandboxy, and if they did that, they could get so much more content and make that so much more rich and vibrant. I mean, what if they made what if they even made like a player housing system in Classic that felt all janky and old, that literally would be like the player housing system that we're almost entirely sure they were prototyping for and around the Classic era? What if they actually took some of those weird old things and they banged them in there just to see what it's like? Who knows? Who the hell knows? I certainly don't, but if there was just, for me, that understanding that I could go into this old version of WoW, but it would actually grow in interesting ways, I'd be totally down for that. Totally.
That would be like, it would be making such incredible use of the popularity of Classic and everything else that it kind of feels like a no-brainer, but I think based on how that's worded, with the laying for high populations, changes to the PvP honor system, etc., I actually think this is them quietly, because they there wasn't, as far as I could see, a huge pushback from the announcement of TBC Classic that they were going to make changes.
Yeah.
I think that this is more intended to be, we're going to mirror those changes to Classic, so then the experience is actually better now that we're free of the no changes people. It's interesting because I feel like the further we get into the like TBC and Wrath kind of stuff, more players will be less expecting a solved game, and there's a lot more freedom there. So I think this might be them mirroring that back now that the people who have had the solved game experience are more or less through with it.
Yeah.
And I would love for this to be something a little bit more than that, but I think it is really holding on hope that it'll be massive changes. I mean, obviously small system changes like the World PP can go a huge way, but I think you brought up at the very start new raid tiers. I cannot imagine them devoting the resources to that. Which is a shame.
Actually, even that is a part of why I say it should be done. Actually, because Molten Core. Now look, Molten Core. I mean, I think Preach actually did a video on this recently. It's like near the bottom of his raid list because yeah, it was the first raid they ever did. But it did generate a lot of content, a lot of game time, and Molten Core was literally banged together in a week. Now, this is the thing. If you're making new stuff for WoW Classic, it's way easier to make. Now, you're probably going to have to deal with spaghetti code, files and workflows that feel absolutely ancient to engage with as developers. So there's going to be a bunch of issues there. But I think that fundamentally developing new content for a WoW Classic Plus is going to be so much easier. And I just think the way that game is set up and the expectations the Classic players seem to have, the things they seem to be okay with and enjoy, I think that, seriously could open us up for an incredible experience. And I would say that it would not take a lot of resources to make that happen. It basically could be a third WoW product if done right. And thinking about how little it would cost to do an experiment like that, who knows? It would be tricky. You've got problems like PvP has so much potential in an older version of Azeroth, but how do you get server balance right? Do you make some weird sort of server where, initially there's only 10,000 slots for each faction, and they slowly increase those over time in order to load balance? Who the hell knows, really? But I just think there is some way of spinning up a new Classic Plus server that could just be absolute. The way that people have got back into old school RuneScape, and they have stuck with old school RuneScape for so long. Jagex as a company, it's getting, investment, acquisition. It is doing biz dev to the moon. And I get the impression a bunch of that is built off old school RuneScape, completely just doing gangbusters for them.
Yeah, I think that's I do tend to get caught up a little what Blizzard won't do as opposed to what they very much could do. And the idea of, reminding me that Molten Core was done in a week, it's like, yeah, if they don't make it purely a sandbox for players, if they also make it a sandbox for whoever they have kicking around working on that, then I think the idea of it being a third product would actually be really, really interesting. It's just a matter of can they let go of any standards they personally hold, okay, we'll need to totally okay this raid. If they can get over all of those people who expect the solved game that they want to revisit, if they can break through and sell the idea, then it is obviously the idea of, obviously you wouldn't want to do a raid in a week because MC is not a good raid.
No.
And I imagine that week wasn't a 40-hour work week from a couple of people. I believe that was basically all hands on deck. Absolute crunch nightmare mode. But it's it's horrible to get anyone's hopes up, but the idea of just hey, yeah, it's been 2 months, here's a new raid we banged out. It's we game jammed this raid basically.
And a lot of people might think, but where's the content? Well, look, what is the next expansion? It's going to the Burning Crusade. So, the storylines of Azeroth, in so many ways, they didn't progress until Cataclysm happened. And that means you could easily do... imagine the amount of money that Blizzard would make if they got up at a BlizzCon, they announced Classic Plus, and they said, World of Warcraft, Classic Plus, the Pirates of Booty Bay. And it turns out that is a micro expansion to WoW Classic where there is more Booty Bay content. Maybe it ties into the other Goblin cartels. They can get a new piratey themed raid that feels really WoW Classic. And there you go. You have just went, and it's almost like the Hearthstone approach of taking a bit of old school World of Warcraft and actually advancing it a little bit. And you could do that in a really cool way. Because imagine if they introduced the island of Kazan as a new zone to go to. You could actually go to a Kazan in the busted, janky WoW Classic art that would actually be that area before we saw it in Cataclysm. And you could actually lean on the fact that this is the past in really cool ways to build out Azeroth. You know, right now they're doing that in books like Exploring Eastern Kingdoms, but they could do that in a WoW Classic. I mean, just think of the amount of cool plot lines and cool things going on in the world of original Azeroth that you could just expand. And I imagine expand in a way that is far cheaper than any of that in the current game right now. Because if you're making that content in the game right now, you're like, well, why are we doing a pirate thing when we're in the Shadowlands? That makes absolutely no sense. Why would we ever put the WoW modern development team onto making a cool pirate mini thing when they could be working in the new patch content in the Shadowlands? Whereas it makes complete sense in something like Classic Plus.